"Johnson, homework," the teacher boomed. The schoolboy experienced the familiar stab of dread, but life was different since he'd found the watch. He reached for it in his pocket, feeling its cold metallic case and domed glass front. He pushed the stem. Time halted, and all the people with it. The teacher, his finger pointed and mouth ajar. Becky Thompson, blowing pink gum past her braces, the bubble frozen in permanent stasis. Even the birds outside the window, their wings stiffened. He finished his homework, then clicked the watch again. Time marched on. The one thing he knew for certain, he wasn't tired at school anymore. He heard his mother shout from downstairs and rolled over where the watch was waiting on the nightstand. "You know, I'm proud of you, son," his mom said. "You're really motivated these days." He grunted in return, burying his face into the bacon and egg omelet she'd made for breakfast. His dad looked up from his iPod. "Would you chew your food, lad? You're not a dog." "Leave him alone, Harry. He's costing me a fortune in new clothes. He's grown 4 inches in 3 months." That was not strictly true. He had grown 4 inches, but not in 3 months. With all the times he'd used the watch, that 3 months had been more like 12, biologically speaking. The schoolboy looked up over his omelet at his dad and pressed the watch. Coolly, he got right into his father's face so he could feel the bristles of his beard against his skin and screamed, "Fuck you." He returned to his seat and restarted time. His father cocked his face to one side, almost like Max the dog, as if a sixth sense told him something was not quite right. Then he dismissed it and continued reading the paper as the schoolboy smiled to himself. Thankfully, the school term was almost over, meaning he did not need to use the watch as often. This particular day, there was a trip to London. On the bus, he sat beside his best friend, Carl Flanagan. Chat, as usual, turned to girls, and specifically, Becky Thompson. "You know, they say she's sleeping with Tommy Duncan in 6th form. He paid her to have her tits done." "She's 14, he replied. "So? You're telling me a doctor in England gave a 14-year-old a boob job? Not in England, Turkey. He took her to Marmaris in the last holiday." "You talk some shit." "What I'd give to feel him," Carl replied, looking dreamily out of the window at the suburbs drifting by. And that's how he stayed, because the schoolboy clicked. It was certainly eerie the first time he used the watch. At first, he thought it might be a practical joke, that a YouTuber was going to jump out on him. And then he tested it on Max, the golden retriever. Max had sat there like he was taxidermied, and just to make sure, the schoolboy had waved a dog biscuit in front of his face. Nothing. You would think that the awe-inspiring, logic-destroying power of a magic pocket watch might send a person out of their mind, but not the schoolboy. You forget that at 14, you're still little more than a kid operating on a very narrow bandwidth. Santa Claus is still in your rearview mirror. All that matters is that your life is as easy as possible. It was tempting to compare his immobile classmates to statues, but that was not quite right. They were what a sculptor strives for. They were perfect, natural, physical representations locked in place. They struck poses that would have been very difficult to fake. Stephen Lee yawned, the right side of his face drawn higher than the left, a piece of breakfast showing in his teeth. Jason Shepard, his finger plugged into his lug hole, a look of idiotic pleasure etched across his face. The bus driver, eyes half closed in the middle of a blink, his left hand on the wheel, and the right about to scratch his balls. Becky Thompson was at the back, where the cool kids sat. He knelt and waved his hand in front of her face. She did not stir. Her blue eyes were like marbles. He had done this many times, yet he still had the terrible fear that they'd wake up. A curious thing about the phenomenon was that smell ceased to work. It must have been something to do with electronically charged particles, he figured, because electronics didn't work either. Otherwise, he might have wasted his entire life playing Red Dead Redemption 2. Becky always smelled of bubblegum and perfume when she was awake, but in her frozen state, there was nothing. The schoolboy reached out. He knew it was wrong, criminal even. He squeezed her left breast and it softened under his touch. It would have been tempting to go further, but somehow, instinctively, he knew that was a dark path he might never return from. He rejoined his seat, making sure to sit in the same position, and clicked. "They're not fake," he said to Carl. "Like you would fucking know." He glanced over his shoulder as Becky Thompson readjusted her bra. Their bus rolled into central London. The only negative of the device was that time could not be sped up. Basically, it was a tool to drive you to distraction. If you were in the middle of a particularly hard test, it might take you 24 hours to complete. You'd do 10 minutes, grow bored, stop time, walk around the other classrooms, return, start time, do another 10 minutes, go home, read a comic book for 3 hours, and so on. It was with a certain irony that the class trip was to Madame Tussauds. He and Carl split off from the rest and walked amongst the waxworks. He was beside Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, striking a muscled pose, all 5'5" of them and weighing 8 stone. They stopped in front of the royal family. "What do you suppose they're doing right now?" Carl said. "Something better than this. My old man says they're shape-shifting lizard people who sacrifice virgins to the devil." "You should be careful then." They laughed at each other, and then Carl reached out for the Princess of Wales and felt her plastic chest. "Go on, get a picture. It'll be funny." But before they had a chance, one of the guides shouted. Carl panicked, tripped over, and sent the statue toppling on them. Afterward, Carl didn't pay much attention to the derisive laughter of his classmates. He was used to it. Instead, he complained of the cut on his hand. However, the schoolboy flushed scarlet and hit the watch immediately. The laughter died. There was only the suggestion of it on their paralyzed faces. He glanced down at Carl, who was attending the cut on his hand. Drops of blood hung in the air like splashes on wallpaper. Becky Thompson nearby was texting on her phone. He went up behind her, looking over her shoulder. It was half written out. "You should see what just happened at Madame Tussauds. These fucking What was she gonna say? These lads? These losers? He couldn't stand it. He needed to get away. He couldn't deal with that level of embarrassment in real time. He wandered aimlessly around London until he was lost. It was a kind of reverse zombie movie. There was always that shot of a man walking around an abandoned city, yet the city was fully inhabited. Tourists and bankers and market traders and homeless people and pigeons and motorbikes and cars and buses. It was like the model village of a giant. In those zombie movies, suddenly the city would fill and the undead would chase the main character. But again, here was the exact opposite. He was the safest boy on the planet because he was the only boy on the planet. He went to McDonald's, hopped the counter, grabbed a handful of Big Macs, and was on his way again. Eventually, he came to a building he recognized, Buckingham Palace. The king was home, his standard flying from the flagpole. As luck would have it, a delegation was leaving the heavily armed main gate so he could slide right into the courtyard. It had crossed his mind to use the watch to commit some great crime like stealing the crown jewels. But ultimately, what would he do with a golden scepter? It wasn't like he could sell it on eBay. At the front door was a leaflet for visiting dignitaries. The palace felt abandoned, and not just because he was the only person moving. 775 rooms for 2 folks and their flunkies. It was a shame, all that art. He flicked through the leaflet. Holbein, Rembrandt, Rubens. He didn't like any of it. But someone like Mr. Shell, the art teacher, probably would. He spent many hours walking around. There were literally too many rooms to remember. The staterooms, the ballroom, the music room. When he got to the throne room, he stopped and sat in one of the chairs of state. He dived into his bag for another Big Mac and ate it, sitting right there on the throne. He smiled to himself and whispered, "I am the Burger King." Now he was laughing through mouthfuls of bread and meat. Finally, at the top of his lungs, he screamed, "The Burger King demands you kneel in his presence." Silence. Just the staring eyes of the stately portraits. That was the thing when the watch was operational. It was so silent you could be on the moon. It made you introspective. He got thinking about what Carl had said. Were the royals really Satan-worshipping, shape-shifting lizard people? Carl was an odd bod, and his dad, a man who'd made the local paper after chaining himself to a COVID-19 vaccine van, was even stranger. Then again, the schoolboy was the owner of a magical watch. He consulted the map and set off for the private apartments. These were another palace unto themselves, and unlike what he might have thought. They were surprisingly modern, with a cinema, swimming pool, and gym. The most curious thing was a post office, and inside an ATM. He supposed if your face was on the money, then you didn't have to queue on the high street. After a while of wandering, he found the bedrooms. Again, most of the rooms were empty save for a butler or a maid, and then he came across them. It was the Queen he saw first. She stood at the wardrobe looking back over her shoulder at the bathroom door. On the bed was a collection of dresses, some exposed and some in covers. He opened the bathroom door. The King of England sat on a porcelain throne. He didn't hold a golden scepter, rather his mobile, no doubt mindlessly scrolling while nature called. Where were the child sacrifices, the antechambers where they laid their eggs? He glanced at the dresses that belonged to the former queen. They'd done the same thing for his grandma when she'd died. His parents cleared away her things and took him to the charity shop. He climbed into the bed and took his school uniform off, placing the pocket watch on the pillow beside him. It was probably around 2 a.m. his time. He leaned back and luxuriated in the silk sheets, and soon he was asleep as the king and queen waited like sentries. The next day, or rather when he woke up, he made the bed and let himself out. He took a quick dip in the royal swimming pool by way of a shower and ate some mince he found in one of the servants' rooms. What exactly was a period of time he could not exactly be sure of. He woke when he wanted, slept when he wanted, ate when he wanted. He went to the Tower of London, Trafalgar Square, the immobile London Eye. Around day 7, or was it 17, he climbed to the top of the Shard and watched the sun as it neither rose nor set, but hung as if suspended on wire. It was time to return to Madame Tussaud and exit his little dream world. Although it took a further 2 days to find his way back, tourist maps were harder to decipher than Google Maps. He got into as close a position as he could remember and restarted time. The drops of blood from Carl's hand hit the ground. Becky Thompson finished her message, and the laughter continued and pittered out as angry museum guides righted the statue. It did not hurt the schoolboy. Weeks had passed. Time, after all, is a great healer. They stopped at a nearby park to eat their packed lunches. It always took the schoolboy some time to readjust. The world seemed to be moving too quickly. It was like when you're watching a video and hit the wrong button and the YouTuber moves at 2 times speed. Carl was chatting his usual shit when he suddenly paused. I swear that wasn't there this morning. What? That mustache. The schoolboy reached for his upper lip. Sure enough, there was a fine line of hair. Not quite a mustache. What his dad would have called bum fluff. It's just the light. I swear you're bigger since this morning. The schoolboy stayed silent, fumbling for an answer that wouldn't come. Of course, Carl continued, Dad says that's because of all the hormones they're putting in our food. And they're turning the frogs gay. The schoolboy laughed and looked grimly down at the leftover omelet his mom had packed. It was perfectly edible, but he could not get over the psychological barrier that he'd first seen it last month. He clicked the watch. A man nearby was selling sandwiches, so he helped himself and returned to Carl. He was about to click when he thought, no, let's just enjoy this piece. He was on his 3rd or 4th mouthful when the pieces of meat lodged in his throat. He slapped himself on the chest. Nothing. He stood up, now panicking, and tried to force it with a cough. Nothing. It was stuck fast. He clawed at his pocket for the watch. His only chance was the Heimlich maneuver. In his panic, the watch slipped from his grasp, and he accidentally kicked it into the bushes. Turning blue, he dug frantically with his hands at the foliage, but the watch was out of his grasp. He reared backward, crashing into the statues of the other students. Some tipped over with a thud like frozen pieces of beef in a meat locker. And soon, too, the schoolboy collapsed, his consciousness departing. Going, gone. The last thing he saw was his classmates arranged around him like the waxworks of Madame Tussaud. So that was how the world didn't end. No bang or cosmic contraction. It was the big freeze. An eternity spent in place. The observed without an observer.